you have an upcoming book, Anxiety Hacks for an Uncertain World, or it already came out, or is it a re-release?
It was released like 3 weeks ago.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah,
Okay,
thank you.
I can see it. Anxiety Hacks for an Uncertain World.
Yes, that's the paperback version, and there's a hardcover version, which is a lot more expensive.
Yes,
It's actually a textbook as well as a general trade book and a clinician's kind of supplemental guide for patients as well. And it's the first self-help humor book on mental health, especially for academia. It was extensively peer-reviewed, so it's not just stories of me train wrecking my life. It's evidence-based clinical tactics that I've stripped out each chapter is a trigger essentially. So there's 22 chapters, and each chapter is like divorce, breakup, pandemic, job loss, any of the big adverse events, moving, that sort of thing that you can think of. And then there's the second half of each chapter is those tactics to implement on the fly, which is the difference of this book than others. There's no workbooks, worksheets. The last thing you want to do when you're in the perils of some anxiety triggering event is to have to do homework. So I've taken that out and made things very palatable for people. If you Google, and I talk about this in the book, if you Google celebrities with mental illness or celebrities with anxiety, celebrities with depression, it's pretty much everybody that you've ever heard of. And comedians, musicians, writers, artists. It's a double-edged sword because the creativity comes from the coping that we use to get through these other things. So, would I trade all of the adversity and give up the writing? It's a big question. It's a philosophical.
Nobody has to ask you. You don't. Luckily, you're not being asked that question.
Yeah. At some point I would have, but now I'm like, no, it's kind of working out.
Yeah. Well, to me, journaling and meditation I was just asked, I've put together a clarity and confidence scorecard, actually. And I was asked, well, what are the two biggest or best tools? I don't know what the right adjective is, but I said journaling. It's a no-brainer. Journaling and meditation are hands down the best tools. So what are some tools that we can use to deal with anxiety when it arises? Because sometimes I was taught if it's hysterical, it's historical. If I'm having some overreaction to a situation, it's not the situation. It's triggering me somehow. And I don't need to know why, or in the moment, something's going on, but how do I get through it at that time?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Did that question make sense?
Yeah, it's mastery over emotions. I mean, essentially it's our response to things, which is why exposure response prevention, which is one of the methodologies I talk about. I strip all the acronyms out in the book. I don't even mention that. It might be mentioned, but I really just work on, okay, what do you do with this? And by way of example, if you're afraid of driving on the freeway, well, you get on the freeway in a car. With OCD tendencies, for example, avoidance is only going to exacerbate the problem. So it depends on your anxiety, but there's, anxiety first and foremost is we need it. It's how we survived. It's why we're here today. It's how we pay the bills. It's, really how I showed up on time to talk to you today. We need it in a small amount, right? It keeps us alive. It's when it becomes chronic, after it goes past a few months and it starts becoming debilitating and interfering with life, that is where the issue comes. And so that's the anxiety I talk about. And there's buckets of anxiety, and, there's generalized anxiety disorder. OCD used to be part of that, but now it's in its own category according to the DSM-5. But you've got, social phobias, you've got PTSD, which is really in its own category now. And so there's these different buckets or categories, which I have in the book. And then you have the different kind of anxieties that might fall under those. And generalized anxiety is really the catch-all. And so depending on your anxiety and your fear, there's different approaches to alleviating it. I talk a lot about not just loneliness, but male loneliness, because it's an epidemic in and of itself.
Yes.
Let alone, I talk about manxiety, which is male anxiety, which is different than other genders, and how we handle it is different. And it is hard. Men tend to silo quite a bit. We tend to rely on our partners for all of our social interaction more. Yeah. And if you've seen the Saturday Night Live skit, Man Park, it is it just nails it. It's fantastic. I recommend anybody to Google Man Park SNL. We're all guilty of that for men. And even though I talk a lot about this, but I'm guilty of it myself. I will make excuses why I can't meet with somebody. I've had perfect opportunities to hang out with a guy and then I don't. For men, there's also the vulnerability of our egos and being perceived a certain way. Like, how do you ask another man out? And it's really, it becomes a very awkward dance because we don't want to be misread and we're idiots. All of these different tactics for every one of these situations. And I think I've definitely addressed everything we've talked about in the book, but I don't want to give away all the tactics because then nobody will buy my book. I do want to stress that they are interchangeable tactics for any anxiety that you're suffering. And, for AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, there's a saying that, you're triggered to drink if you experience any of the HALT symptoms. So hungry, angry, lonely, tired. It's similar with anxiety. So if you isolate, that's a trigger, the alcohol, the caffeine. If you're not working out, exercise is getting more and more publicity now as because it generates a protein called BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotropic factor. It's a protein that literally causes a change in the brain. And don't ask me the clinical speak on it, but it boosts mood and lifts depression. And it's a great anti-anxiety tactic. So it actually beats medication. So, these are easy to do. Take a walk. Looking at trees will shift and alleviate anxiety. And I mean, just out your window, trees are awesome. All of ours are falling down right now with the floods and mudslides, but we have some trees left, so I'm looking at them.
So what's the hardest challenge you've ever gone through? How'd you get through it?
Oh, that's a great question. You blindsided me, Lauren.
No, yeah.
I'd say the hardest has been my own anxiety and depression because it's been lifelong. It probably started at 13. I was a cutter and I started cutting. I didn't know what was wrong with me. I had all these thoughts that didn't make sense, suicidal ideations. I just wasn't wired like other people, and I knew that. And I was a little league pitcher at the time, I remember, and I was having what was diagnosed as asthma because anxiety wasn't a thing yet, wasn't cool yet. I was having anxiety attacks on the pitcher's mound, and no one knew that. They thought, here's an inhaler. It's like, well, that actually makes it worse. It's got ephedrine in it, so it's just spiking my anxiety. And so I had all these worries, and I was like a existentialist at the time. I remember I was like always laying in bed thinking, what if we were never born? And what makes our soul our soul? Why am I not a rabbit? And, all of these crazy things that I would think about, and no kid should be thinking about these things. I should be playing with my G.I. Joe. But I had to learn through, fortunately, my parents kind of recognized, okay, she's got a lot of cuts on him. There's something going on. And I would lie and say it was from our cat. It was clearly not the pattern of a claw. And that's a true story. I did tell them that. So, I ended up in therapy. I ended up on medication, but it's been a lifelong process. And that's been the hardest thing I've ever had to really deal with.